A dying parrot fell into a tiger's enclosure, triggering a sequence of events that left zookeepers screaming in disbelief. The unthinkable encounter between prey and predator was about to shatter everything these animal experts thought they knew. As the frail bird plummeted into the domain of nature's perfect killer, no one could have predicted the shocking aftermath. What they witnessed that day would forever change how they understood the animal kingdom. For over 30 years, a vibrant scarlet macaw named Ruby had been the heart and soul of Riverside Zoo. She wasn't just another bird in a cage. She was a living legend, a creature that had watched generations of children grow up while perched majestically in her enclosure. Visitors would line up for hours just to catch a glimpse of her brilliant red plumage and hear her iconic calls echoing through the zoo grounds. Ruby had become more than an attraction. She was family to everyone who worked there, from the groundskeepers to the director himself. Her story was the stuff of zoo lore. When Ruby first arrived as a young bird in her prime, she had captivated audiences with her intelligence, her playful antics, and her almost human-like ability to interact with people. She learned tricks, responded to her name, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention of her admirers. Over the decades, she had witnessed countless changes, new enclosures, new staff members, new technologies. Yet she remained a constant, an anchor point in the ever-evolving landscape of the zoo. Children who visited Ruby as toddlers would return as teenagers, then as adults with their own children, creating a multi-generational connection that was truly remarkable. But time is merciless, even to the most beloved creatures. In her final months, Ruby's once vibrant feathers had dulled to a faded crimson. Her movements became labored, and her legendary calls faded to weak, raspy whispers that could barely be heard beyond her immediate vicinity. The zookeepers noticed everything. How she struggled to climb to her favorite perch, how she barely touched her food despite their best efforts to tempt her with her preferred treats, how she spent entire days sitting motionless in the corner of her enclosure. The light that had once burned so brightly in her eyes seemed to be slowly draining away, replaced by a tired resignation to her inevitable fate. What had once been a bird, radiating pure vitality and endless energy, was now a shadow of her former self, fighting a silent battle against age and illness that no amount of veterinary care, medication, or love could ultimately win. One zookeeper in particular, Marcus Chen, had devoted nearly 2 decades to Ruby's well-being and care. He had been there since she was middle-aged, and he had watched her transition from her glory years into this final chapter with a mixture of admiration and heartbreak. Marcus knew every quirk, how she preferred her fruit cut into specific sizes, how she loved to be misted with water on hot days, how she had a favorite corner where she liked to nap in the afternoon sun. He understood her moods, her preferences, her subtle changes in behavior that others might miss. Marcus would arrive before dawn, spending extra hours with her long after his shift had ended, whispering to her in soft tones, ensuring her final days were filled with comfort and dignity. The bond between them was unbreakable, a connection that transcended the barrier between human and animal, a testament to the profound relationships that could form when one creature devoted themselves entirely to the well-being of another. He had made a silent promise to Ruby years ago, a promise he intended to keep. He would be there for her, no matter what came next, through sickness and health, through joy and sorrow. But no one could have predicted how this ordinary Tuesday morning at the zoo would turn into a moment that would haunt them forever, a moment that would challenge everything they believed about nature, instinct, and the unpredictable forces that govern the animal kingdom. The morning of October 15th dawned like any other day at Riverside Zoo. Yet the universe seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. The sun filtered through the autumn leaves in brilliant shades of gold and amber, casting dappled shadows across the weathered pathways that had been walked by millions of visitors over the decades. A gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and fallen leaves, mixing with the familiar smells of the zoo, hay, animal feed, and the earthy musk of creatures both great and small. Staff members arrived early, as they always did, carrying heavy buckets of fresh fruit, crisp vegetables, and carefully prepared meals for the hundreds of animals in their care. The air was crisp and cool, invigorating and refreshing, carrying the promise of a pleasant day ahead. The morning chorus of birds filled the sky with their songs, a natural symphony that seemed to celebrate the arrival of another day. Few could have imagined that by noon, this day would become one of the most talked about moments in the zoo's entire history, a day that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. Marcus Chen arrived at his usual time, 5:47 a.m., exactly 17 minutes before the official start of his shift. He had maintained this routine for nearly 2 decades, always arriving early, always eager to spend those precious extra moments with Ruby before the chaos and demands of the day began. He carried her favorite breakfast in a carefully prepared container, a meticulously selected mix of macadamia nuts, sunflower seeds, pine nuts, and fresh papaya, all cut into her preferred bite-sized pieces that she could easily grasp with her powerful beak. His worn leather jacket bore the patches and stains of countless mornings spent in her company. As he walked through the quiet zoo, his footsteps echoing on the empty pathways, he noticed something was subtly different about the morning. The usual activity of early arriving staff seemed muted somehow, as if the entire zoo was holding its breath. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the morning felt heavier, laden with invisible weight and significance, as if the air itself was weighted with the knowledge of something momentous about to unfold. When Marcus reached Ruby's enclosure, his heart sank like a stone dropping into deep water. She was perched unusually low on one of the lower branches, her breathing labored and shallow, each breath seeming to require enormous effort. Her head drooped forward at an unnatural angle, and she didn't respond to his cheerful greeting as she normally did. No excited squawk or fluffing of feathers. Instead, she remained motionless, almost statue-like in her stillness. Marcus immediately knew with the certainty that comes from years of intimate knowledge that today was different, profoundly different. Today might be the day he had been dreading for months, the day he had prepared himself for emotionally, yet could never truly be ready for. He quickly called out to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the zoo's head veterinarian and a woman he had worked alongside for over a decade, urgently asking her to come assess Ruby's condition as soon as possible. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying the emotions he was struggling to contain. While waiting for the doctor to arrive, Marcus sat on the bench beside Ruby's enclosure, speaking to her in hushed, tender tones, telling her stories of their years together, memories of her younger days, tales of the children she had delighted, moments of connection that had meant everything to him. He reminded her of all the joy she had brought to so many lives, of the countless smiles she had inspired, of the wonder she had created in the eyes of visitors from around the world. He held her food dish nearby, though she showed no interest in eating, no spark of appetite. His eyes glistened with unshed tears as he watched the bird he had devoted nearly 2 decades to care for struggle with each breath, each movement requiring what seemed like monumental effort. His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the glass, wishing he could reach through and comfort her directly, wishing he could take away her pain and suffering. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within minutes, moving with practiced efficiency born from years of experience. Her expression was grave and serious as she examined Ruby through the protective glass of the enclosure, her trained eyes taking in every detail. The bird's posture, her breathing patterns, the dullness of her once brilliant eyes. After a thorough and careful assessment that lasted nearly 15 minutes, she delivered the news Marcus had been intellectually preparing himself to hear for weeks, yet emotionally could never fully accept. Ruby's organs were failing, her condition was rapidly deteriorating at an accelerated pace, and she likely had only hours left, perhaps less. The veterinarian, speaking with compassionate professionalism, recommended that they consider euthanasia, a peaceful and painless end to her suffering, a final act of mercy and love. Marcus nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the decision, understanding the logic and the necessity of it, yet feeling as though his heart was being torn from his chest, as though a vital part of himself was slipping away. The decision was made with heavy hearts. They would give Ruby a few more hours in the morning sun, allow visitors and staff to say their goodbyes, and then, when the time came and her suffering became too great, they would help her pass peacefully into whatever lay beyond. Word spread quickly through the zoo staff like wildfire, passed from person to person in hushed tones and with visible emotion. Soon, people began arriving from all corners of the facility. Groundskeepers who had maintained her enclosure, tour guides who had told countless stories about her to visitors, administrative staff who had worked in offices but still considered Ruby a beloved colleague, veterinary assistants who had helped care for her, and even retired staff members who had worked with Ruby decades ago. By mid-morning, a small but growing crowd had gathered near Ruby's enclosure, creating a solemn and respectful vigil. Some stood in silent contemplation, others shared memories and stories of their favorite Ruby moments, speaking in reverent tones about her personality, her intelligence, her remarkable character. Children who had grown up visiting Ruby over the years were brought by their parents, creating a bittersweet atmosphere of celebration mixed with profound grief. The air was thick with emotion, love, sadness, gratitude, and the complex feelings that come with witnessing the end of an era. Ruby seemed to sense the attention and the outpouring of affection, and despite her pain and weakness, she held her head a bit higher, as if accepting the love and gratitude being poured upon her, as if understanding that this was her moment, her farewell to the world that had loved her so dearly. But none of them, not Marcus, not Dr. Mitchell, not the gathered crowd of mourners, could have anticipated what would happen next. None of them could have foreseen the event so unexpected, so shocking, so utterly impossible, that it would change everything in a single instant, challenging every assumption they held about nature, about instinct, and about the unpredictable forces that govern the animal kingdom. At precisely 11:43 a.m., on that fateful October afternoon, something extraordinary and utterly inexplicable occurred. Something that would later be debated, analyzed, dissected, and discussed by everyone who witnessed it, and by countless others who heard about it through news reports, social media, and word of mouth. The crowd around Ruby's enclosure had grown to nearly 50 people by that time, a diverse mix of dedicated zoo staff, regular visitors who had heard the heartbreaking news, curious onlookers, and local news reporters who had caught wind of the story through their police scanners and social media channels. The atmosphere was reverent and solemn, almost sacred and cathedral-like, as if they were all gathered in a place of profound spiritual significance, rather than at a simple zoo enclosure on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ruby had been increasingly still and motionless throughout the morning hours, her breathing becoming more shallow and irregular with each passing hour that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Dr. Mitchell had checked on her twice more, each time confirming with quiet certainty that the end was drawing inexorably near, that the final chapter was about to close. Marcus stood closest to the glass barrier, his weathered hand pressed firmly against the cool surface, his eyes never wavering or leaving the bird he had loved and cared for across nearly 2 decades of his life. He had called in favors from colleagues, had rearranged his entire schedule, had done everything in his power to ensure that when the time came, when Ruby's suffering finally ended, he would be the one to be with her, to ease her passage into whatever lay beyond, to ensure that her final moments were surrounded by compassion, dignity, and unconditional love. The afternoon sun was beginning its slow, inevitable descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold, when the impossible happened. Ruby suddenly straightened on her wooden perch with dramatic intensity, her entire body going rigid and tense as if seized by some invisible force. Her dull, faded eyes that had grown cloudy and dim with age and illness, suddenly blazed with an ethereal light that hadn't been visible in months, perhaps years. The transformation was instantaneous and unmistakable. Her eyes seemed to glow with a brilliant, almost supernatural luminescence that appeared to emanate from deep within her soul, as if some inner fire had suddenly been rekindled. Everyone in the gathered crowd gasped simultaneously, their collective intake of breath creating an eerie, haunting silence that seemed to suspend time itself. The sound was like a single organism reacting to something beyond their comprehension, a unified acknowledgement of the extraordinary nature of what was unfolding before their eyes. Then Ruby opened her beak and sang. It wasn't the weak, raspy, heartbreaking sound that had characterized her vocalizations in recent weeks. The painful reminders of her declining health and fading vitality. This was her voice from her glory days, from decades past when she was in her prime, powerful, clear, resonant, and hauntingly, achingly beautiful. The song that emerged from her throat was unlike anything anyone had ever heard her produce before. Nothing in the repertoire of sounds they associated with her. It wasn't a simple call or the familiar, recognizable vocalizations of a macaw that they had come to know over the years. This was a complex, multi-layered, intricate melody that seemed to contain within it the echoes and reverberations of 30 years. Every sound she had ever made, every call and screech and joyful cry, every vocalization from her entire life, woven together into a single, transcendent composition that defied explanation. The melody soared and dipped, building in intensity and emotion, carrying within it what seemed like profound meaning and purpose. It was as if Ruby was distilling her entire existence into this final song, creating a musical autobiography that spoke to something deep within the human soul. The notes seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through the very hearts and minds of everyone present. People in the crowd began to weep openly and without restraint, their emotions overwhelming any attempt at composure or dignity. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sheer power of what they were experiencing. A few stepped backward, their rational, scientific minds struggling desperately to process and make sense of what they were witnessing, what seemed impossible by every law of nature and biology they understood. Others simply stood transfixed, unable to move or speak, as if they had been transported to another realm entirely. The song continued for what felt like an eternity to those listening, though it was actually only 3 minutes and 47 seconds. A duration that would later be precisely confirmed by reviewing the security camera footage that had captured the entire event in meticulous detail. Every second of that song seemed to contain infinite meaning, infinite emotion, infinite connection. Marcus stood completely frozen in place, tears streaming down his weathered face in torrents, his hand still pressed against the cold glass, as if trying to bridge the barrier between them. He felt as though he was witnessing something sacred and holy, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries between life and death, between the animal world and something greater, something beyond human understanding. The song seemed to be directed specifically at him, as if Ruby was speaking to him in the only language she had ever known, conveying something profound and essential that mere words could never capture or express. As the final notes of the song faded gradually into silence, dissolving like mist in the afternoon air, Ruby's body relaxed and settled. She repositioned herself back onto her wooden perch with deliberate care, her breathing once again becoming shallow and labored, returning to the difficult rhythm that had characterized her final days. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. The light in her eyes remained, softer now and more gentle, but still distinctly present, still burning with that inner luminescence that had briefly blazed so brilliantly. She turned her head slowly and with evident effort, moving with the deliberation of one who knew their time was limited. She looked directly at Marcus, their eyes meeting across the distance that separated them. In that moment of connection, Marcus felt something so powerful, so complete, so transcendent, that it seemed to encompass and distill their entire relationship into a single instant. All the mornings spent together in quiet companionship, all the care and love he had poured into her life with unwavering devotion, all the ways she had enriched and transformed his world, all the joy and meaning she had brought to his existence. Then, peacefully and without struggle or pain, Ruby closed her eyes gently. Her breathing slowed incrementally, becoming shallower with each passing second, then stopped entirely. She had passed away, slipping from this world as gracefully as she had lived in it, leaving behind a legacy of love and wonder that would echo through the hearts of everyone who had known her. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. No one moved. No one spoke. The crowd stood in stunned, reverent silence, each person processing individually what they had collectively witnessed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire world had paused to honor the passing of this remarkable creature. Then, slowly and gradually, people began to move again. Some embraced each other, seeking comfort and connection in their shared grief. Some continued to cry openly, their tears a testament to the profound impact Ruby had made on their lives. Others simply stood in quiet, meditative contemplation, honoring the memory of the extraordinary bird who had just left them, who had given them one final gift before departing. Dr. Mitchell approached Marcus with careful, respectful steps and placed a gentle, compassionate hand on his shoulder. "She said goodbye," the veterinarian whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "She wanted you to know that she was ready, that she was grateful, that she loved you." Marcus nodded slowly, unable to speak. His grief and wonder mingled together in a way that defied explanation or rational understanding. Words seemed inadequate, insufficient to capture the magnitude of what had just transpired. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was only just beginning, only the prologue to something far more mysterious and profound. The news of Ruby's passing spread through Riverside Zoo like wildfire, carried on whispers and urgent phone calls, shared through text messages and social media posts that garnered thousands of shares within hours. By evening, the story had reached local news stations, and by the following morning, it had caught the attention of national media outlets. But it wasn't simply the death of an elderly macaw that captured people's imagination and sparked widespread interest. It was the inexplicable phenomenon that had occurred in her final moments, the impossible song that dozens of witnesses had heard with their own ears. Within 24 hours, the security footage from Ruby's enclosure had been reviewed, analyzed, and authenticated by multiple independent experts. The footage confirmed everything the witnesses had reported: Ruby's sudden revival, the blazing light in her eyes, and most remarkably, the complex, beautiful song that had poured from her throat. Audio specialists examined the recording, attempting to break down the song into its component parts, trying to identify individual notes and patterns. What they discovered was startling. The song contained harmonic frequencies that no macaw should have been physically capable of producing, frequencies that seemed to defy the anatomical limitations of avian vocal structures. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a scientific controversy. Ornithologists from universities across the country reached out, requesting detailed information about Ruby's health history, her genetic background, her behavioral patterns over the years. Some proposed theories about undocumented vocal capabilities in macaws. Others suggested the possibility of some form of neurological phenomenon triggered by the proximity of death. A few, more speculatively, wondered if they had witnessed something that challenged conventional understanding of animal consciousness and communication. Marcus, meanwhile, had taken a leave of absence from the zoo. He spent his days in his small apartment, reviewing old photographs and video recordings of Ruby from throughout the years. He watched her as a young bird, vibrant and energetic, learning to trust him. He saw her grow and mature, develop her personality, become the beloved fixture of the zoo that she had been for 3 decades. And he listened, over and over again, to the recording of her final song, trying to understand what she had been trying to tell him in those final moments. 1 week after Ruby's death, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. It was Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a renowned primatologist and animal behaviorist from the University of California, who had made groundbreaking discoveries about animal cognition and emotional intelligence. She had seen the footage of Ruby's final song and had traveled to meet with Marcus personally. "I believe," Dr. Hartwell said, settling into a chair in Marcus's modest living room, "that what you witnessed was not a biological anomaly or a neurological glitch. I believe Ruby was attempting to communicate something profound, something she had been trying to express for years, perhaps, but only found the strength and clarity to voice in her final moments." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes intense with emotion and curiosity. "What do you think she was trying to say?" "That," Dr. Hartwell replied thoughtfully, "is what I've come to help you discover. I'd like to propose a research initiative, a comprehensive study of Ruby's life, her behaviors, her interactions with you and others, her cognitive patterns. I believe there may be evidence in her history that can help us understand what happened that day." Over the following weeks, Marcus and Dr. Hartwell conducted extensive interviews with zoo staff, reviewed decades of behavioral records, and analyzed video footage from throughout Ruby's life. What emerged was a portrait of a bird of extraordinary intelligence and emotional depth, a creature who had formed profound bonds with the humans around her, who had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that rivaled those of great apes, who had shown clear signs of self-awareness and complex emotional understanding. But there was something else, something that Dr. Hartwell found particularly significant. Throughout her 30-year tenure at the zoo, Ruby had demonstrated an unusual behavior that had never been fully explained. She would occasionally produce specific sequences of vocalizations that seemed to follow patterns, that appeared to have structure and meaning beyond simple animal communication. Zoo staff had always dismissed these as quirks of her personality, idiosyncratic behaviors that made Ruby uniquely herself. But when analyzed with modern acoustic software, these vocalizations revealed something astonishing. They appeared to follow linguistic patterns, structures that suggested Ruby might have been attempting to communicate in ways that transcended typical avian communication. What if, Dr. Hartwell proposed to Marcus one afternoon, Ruby wasn't just singing a goodbye in her final moments? What if she was singing her life story? What if that final song was her attempt to leave behind a record of her existence, her experiences, her consciousness? A legacy encoded in sound. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Hartwell's theory was correct, it would suggest that animals possessed cognitive and communicative abilities far beyond what science had previously acknowledged. It would mean that Ruby, in her final act, had attempted to bridge the gap between her species and humanity, to leave behind something of herself that could be preserved and understood. Marcus obtained a copy of the audio recording and worked with a team of musicians and acoustic engineers to attempt to decode it. They transcribed the song into musical notation, analyzed its structure, examined its patterns. What they discovered was a composition of remarkable complexity. A piece that seemed to tell a story, that moved through different emotional registers, that built and resolved like a symphonic work. But the most remarkable discovery came when a graduate student named James Chen, working on the project, noticed something extraordinary. When the song was played at half speed, certain sections of it seemed to align with specific events from Ruby's life. Moments of joy, moments of connection, moments of loss. It was as if Ruby had somehow encoded her memories, her experiences, directly into the structure of the song itself. News of these findings spread through the scientific community, generating both excitement and skepticism. Some researchers hailed it as evidence of unprecedented animal consciousness. Others dismissed it as coincidence and pattern-seeking. Debate raged in academic journals and at conferences. But for Marcus, the significance was personal and profound. Whether or not science could fully explain what had happened, he knew with absolute certainty that Ruby had given him a final gift, a way to preserve her memory, to understand the depth of their connection, to know that their 30 years together had meant as much to her as they had meant to him. 3 months after Ruby's death, the Riverside Zoo established the Ruby Memorial Research Institute, dedicated to studying animal cognition, communication, and consciousness. The Institute's mission was to explore the inner lives of animals, to develop new methods of understanding how creatures experience the world, and to honor Ruby's legacy by advancing human understanding of our fellow inhabitants of this planet. But even as the Institute began its work, even as researchers continued to analyze and debate the phenomenon of Ruby's final song, a new mystery was beginning to unfold. One that would take the investigation in directions no one could have anticipated. 6 months had passed since Ruby's death, and the world had largely moved on to other news stories, other controversies, other viral moments that captured public attention with the fleeting intensity characteristic of modern media cycles. The Ruby Memorial Research Institute had been formally established with considerable fanfare and had begun recruiting researchers from around the globe, drawing talent from prestigious universities and research institutions across every continent. Yet despite the initial fervor and widespread media attention that had surrounded Ruby's passing, that intense spotlight had faded gradually into the background noise of contemporary culture, displaced by newer stories and emerging crises. However, for those deeply involved in the investigation, Marcus, Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, James Chen, and a growing team of dedicated scientists who had committed themselves to unraveling this mystery. The mystery of Ruby's final song had only deepened considerably, becoming increasingly complex and bewildering with each new discovery, each new piece of evidence that emerged from their meticulous research. The turning point came on a cold, gray February morning, when James Chen made an observation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their research and challenge everything they thought they understood about animal communication. He had been working late into the night, as he often did, meticulously analyzing the audio spectrograms of Ruby's song using advanced software designed specifically for analyzing human speech patterns and linguistic structures. The software had been carefully adapted for use with animal vocalizations, but it had never been used in quite this way before, never applied to such a complex and multi-layered acoustic phenomenon. As he reviewed the data for what must have been the 100th time, his eyes growing tired from staring at computer screens, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat, that sent a jolt of electricity through his entire body. A pattern within the pattern, a structure nested within the larger structure of the song, like Russian matryoshka dolls of sound and meaning. When he isolated and amplified this hidden pattern using specialized filtering techniques, something extraordinary emerged from the data with crystalline clarity. Embedded within Ruby's song, woven so intricately and with such sophistication that it had been virtually undetectable until now, was what appeared to be a sequence of mathematical relationships. Not random mathematical relationships generated by chance or biological accident, but precise, intentional ones that suggested deliberate design and conscious construction. Fibonacci sequences appeared throughout the composition, their golden ratios appearing at key structural points. Prime numbers seemed to mark significant transitions within the song's narrative arc. Mathematical ratios that appeared throughout nature and governed the growth of galaxies and the spiraling of shells seemed to be deliberately incorporated into the piece. It was as if Ruby had somehow encoded mathematical principles into her final composition with meticulous care, as if she had been attempting to communicate on a level that transcended species, that spoke to the fundamental language of the universe itself. The deep mathematical structure that underlies all of reality. James immediately contacted Dr. Hartwell and Marcus with his findings, his excitement barely contained in his voice as he explained what he had discovered. Within hours, they had assembled a team of mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, and specialists in various fields to examine his discovery with rigorous scientific scrutiny. The confirmation came swiftly and decisively from multiple independent sources. Yes, the mathematical patterns were real and verifiable. They were intentional rather than coincidental, and they were far too complex and precisely calibrated to be the result of random chance or biological accident. Someone, or something, had deliberately encoded mathematical information into Ruby's song with remarkable sophistication and precision. But this revelation raised a question that seemed not just difficult, but genuinely impossible to answer. How could a macaw, regardless of her intelligence or cognitive abilities, possess knowledge of advanced mathematics? How could she understand Fibonacci sequences, or prime numbers, or the mathematical ratios that governed natural phenomena across the universe? How could she comprehend concepts that required years of human education to master? It defied everything they knew about avian cognition, about the limits of animal intelligence, about what was theoretically possible for a bird's brain to contain and process. The implications were staggering and profound, and they began to generate serious scientific debate within the academic community. Dr. Hartwell convened a major symposium at the university, inviting leading researchers in animal cognition, neuroscience, mathematics, philosophy, and consciousness studies. The symposium, which was live-streamed to thousands of viewers around the world and generated millions of online discussions, became a platform for discussing not just Ruby's song and its mysterious properties, but fundamental questions about consciousness, intelligence, the nature of communication itself, and the boundaries between human and animal minds. One of the most compelling and thought-provoking presentations came from Dr. Robert Nakamura, a renowned neuroscientist who had spent decades studying the brains of highly intelligent animals with meticulous attention to detail. He presented evidence, drawn from his extensive research, suggesting that certain species of parrots possessed brain structures and neural connections that were far more complex and sophisticated than previously understood by the scientific community. Moreover, he proposed a controversial theory that sparked intense debate among his colleagues. What if intelligence and consciousness were not uniquely human traits confined to our species alone, but existed on a spectrum that extended throughout the animal kingdom? What if animals like Ruby possessed forms of consciousness that were simply different from human consciousness, not inferior to it, but operating according to different principles and accessing different modes of perception? We've been approaching this problem from the wrong angle, Dr. Nakamura argued passionately during his presentation, his voice carrying conviction born from decades of research. We've been asking how Ruby could know mathematics, how she could possibly possess knowledge that seems to require human-level education and abstract thinking. But perhaps the better question is, what if Ruby didn't learn mathematics in the way humans do, through years of formal education and abstract symbolic manipulation? What if she accessed mathematical principles through some form of intuitive understanding, a direct perception of the underlying patterns that govern reality? Some theoretical physicists have proposed that consciousness itself might be a fundamental feature of the universe, not an emergent property of complex brains, but something woven into the fabric of existence itself. What if Ruby was tapping into something like that? A direct perception of the mathematical structure of existence, an intuitive grasp of the principles that organize reality. The audience was divided sharply in their response to this provocative theory. Some researchers found the theory intriguing and worthy of serious exploration and investigation. Others dismissed it outright as pseudoscience and wild speculation unsupported by rigorous evidence. But for Marcus, watching the debate unfold in real time, observing the passionate arguments on both sides, something resonated deeply within him, touching something fundamental in his understanding of his relationship with Ruby. He thought back to those final moments with Ruby, to the inexplicable sense of profound connection he had felt when their eyes met across the barrier between them, to the feeling that, in that moment, something essential had passed between them. What if that connection had been real in a way that transcended normal biological explanation? What if Ruby had, in some mysterious and incomprehensible way, been able to share with him a glimpse of something beyond ordinary perception, something that existed on a level of reality that conventional science had not yet learned to measure or understand? Meanwhile, other discoveries were emerging from the research being conducted by various teams within the Institute. A team of linguists and language specialists examining the structure of Ruby's song began to notice something remarkable and deeply moving. The song appeared to have a narrative arc, a clear beginning, middle, and end that suggested storytelling in its most fundamental form. When they mapped out the emotional content of the song using advanced analysis techniques borrowed from music psychology and emotional recognition software, they discovered that it seemed to follow the emotional trajectory of Ruby's entire life with remarkable accuracy. Beginning with what appeared to be the joy and wonder of youth, progressing through periods of contentment and deep connection with the humans around her, touching poignantly on moments of loss and grief, and culminating in a sense of acceptance and peace. with her own mortality. But there was more to discover, more layers of meaning waiting to be uncovered. Buried within the narrative structure of the song, like treasures hidden in an elaborate labyrinth, were what appeared to be references to specific individuals. Marcus, Dr. Mitchell, various zoo staff members who had been significant in Ruby's life over the decades. The researchers couldn't explain exactly how they knew this with such certainty. Couldn't point to specific acoustic markers that definitively proved these identifications. But when they played certain sections of the song to people who had known Ruby well, those individuals consistently reported feeling as though Ruby was somehow addressing them directly, acknowledging their presence in her life, expressing gratitude for their care and companionship. One particularly moving and emotionally profound moment came when the researchers played a specific section of the song to an elderly woman named Margaret Thompson, who had been one of the zoo's original founders 70 years ago, and had known Ruby since she first arrived at the zoo as a young bird 30 years ago, full of energy and curiosity. Margaret listened to the section with tears streaming down her weathered face, her hands trembling slightly with emotion. When the music ended and silence filled the room once more, she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper, "She's thanking me. She's thanking me for giving her a home, for letting her be part of something meaningful. She understood what I did for her." The researchers couldn't scientifically verify Margaret's interpretation using conventional methods of analysis. Yet they found it genuinely difficult to dismiss the emotional authenticity of her response, the visceral truth that seemed to emanate from her words. It suggested that Ruby's song contained layers of meaning that transcended simple biological explanation, that it communicated on an emotional and spiritual level that conventional science struggled to measure or quantify, that existed beyond the reach of instruments and mathematical analysis. As the research continued with increasing intensity and scope, Marcus found himself becoming increasingly involved in the investigation, not just as a passive participant, but as an active guide and interpreter whose intimate knowledge proved invaluable. His 30 years of intimate daily knowledge of Ruby provided invaluable context for understanding her behavior, her apparent intentions, her development over the decades. He began to work closely with Dr. Hartwell on a comprehensive biography of Ruby's life, documenting her development from a young bird to a wise elder, her relationships with various humans and other animals, her apparent emotional and intellectual growth over the decades, the ways she had changed and evolved. During one of their intensive working sessions, held late in the evening in Dr. Hartwell's office with rain pattering against the windows, Dr. Hartwell asked Marcus a question that had been troubling her deeply. "Do you think Ruby knew she was dying? Do you think she understood what was happening to her body? That her time was coming to an end?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding, drawing on 3 decades of observation and intimate knowledge. "I think Ruby understood more than we give her credit for. Over the years, I noticed that she seemed to have an awareness of things beyond the immediate present, an intuitive grasp of what was coming. She would sometimes act as if she was anticipating events before they happened, as if she possessed some form of precognition. And in those final weeks, she seemed reflective, contemplative, introspective, as if she was thinking about her life, reviewing it somehow, taking stock of her existence. So yes, I think she knew. I think she understood that her time was coming to an end. And I think that understanding shaped her behavior and her choices in those final days." "And the song?" Dr. Hartwell pressed, leaning forward with intense interest. "Do you think she understood what she was doing when she sang it? Do you think she had a purpose, an intention behind it? I think, Marcus said slowly, choosing his words with meticulous care, his voice thoughtful and measured, that Ruby was doing what she had always done throughout her life, communicating the best way she knew how, expressing herself through the only language she possessed. But in that final moment, somehow, in a way that defies explanation, she found a way to communicate more completely, more profoundly than she ever had before. She found a way to tell us who she was, what her life had meant, what her existence had been about. And she did it not for herself, but for us, for those of us who loved her, so that we would understand, so that we would know that our connection with her was real and meaningful and important, that it mattered in the grand scheme of things. Dr. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully, and Marcus could see that his words had resonated deeply with her, had touched something profound in her understanding of the situation. They sat in silence for a long moment, both contemplating the mystery of Ruby's consciousness, the profound and perhaps unanswerable questions her life and death had raised about the nature of existence itself, about what it means to be alive and aware in this universe. But even as they worked diligently to understand Ruby's past, to reconstruct her life and comprehend her final message, new and disturbing questions were emerging about her future, or rather, about what Ruby seemed to have been attempting to communicate regarding the future. The mathematical patterns embedded in her song were beginning to yield unexpected information that suggested something far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Information that suggested Ruby might have been attempting to communicate something about what was to come, something about the future that she seemed to foresee or understand with remarkable clarity and specificity. And this discovery would lead Marcus and the research team down a path they could never have anticipated, into territory that challenged not just scientific understanding and conventional wisdom, but fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality itself, about the boundaries between past and future, about the very fabric of existence and consciousness. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in late March, when James Chen was reviewing the mathematical sequences embedded within Ruby's song for what he thought would be a routine analysis session. He had been working on the project for so long that he had begun to see the patterns in his sleep, dreaming in Fibonacci sequences and prime numbers, his subconscious mind continuing the work even as his body rested. But this time, as he examined the data with fresh eyes, after a brief respite from his intense labors, something extraordinary revealed itself with sudden clarity. A pattern that had been hiding in plain sight all along, obscured by the sheer complexity and sophistication of the overall composition. Like a figure emerging from fog, mathematical sequences, when arranged in a specific order and interpreted through a particular mathematical framework that James had developed through weeks of experimentation and theoretical work, appeared to encode coordinates with remarkable precision. Not just any coordinates, but precise geographical locations on Earth, paired with specific dates and times extending far into the future, reaching forward years and even decades. The implications were staggering and profound. Ruby seemed to have embedded predictive information into her song, a kind of mathematical prophecy that suggested she possessed knowledge of events that had not yet occurred, events that existed only in the future, beyond the veil of time. When James presented this discovery to the research team during an emergency meeting convened hastily in the Institute's main conference room on a gray afternoon with storm clouds gathering outside the windows, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief mixed with cautious excitement and underlying apprehension. Dr. Hartwell listened intently as James walked them through his analysis with meticulous attention to detail, displaying complex diagrams and mathematical proofs on the large screens that lined the walls of the conference room, transforming the space into something resembling a temple of scientific inquiry. The data was compelling and rigorous, the methodology sound and carefully documented. Yet the implications seemed to border on the impossible, challenging everything they understood about the limits of animal cognition and knowledge. "Are you suggesting?" Dr. Hartwell asked carefully, her scientific skepticism warring visibly with the evidence before her, her voice carrying both doubt and fascination. "That Ruby was able to predict future events with mathematical precision, that she encoded those predictions into her final song with intentional design, that she somehow possessed knowledge of what was to come?" "Not just predict," James replied, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of what he was proposing, with the magnitude of the implications he was laying before them. "The mathematical certainty of these sequences suggests something far more profound than mere prediction. It's as if Ruby was describing events that she somehow knew would occur with absolute certainty, with a level of inevitability that transcends probability and chance. The probability of these patterns occurring randomly, of appearing by pure accident, is infinitesimally small. We're talking about odds that make winning the lottery multiple times in a row seem likely by comparison. Odds so remote that they essentially approach zero. Marcus, who had been listening silently from his seat near the window overlooking the research gardens below, felt a chill run down his spine like ice water, a visceral response to what he was hearing. He thought of those final moments with Ruby, of the intensity burning in her eyes, of the sense he had experienced that she was trying to communicate something of profound importance, something that transcended ordinary communication. What if she had been trying to warn them about something terrible to come? What if her song had been an attempt to prepare humanity for something coming? Some event or series of events that she somehow understood would unfold in the future with absolute certainty. Dr. Nakamura, who had been invited to join the research team following his compelling symposium presentation weeks earlier, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers thoughtfully, his expression contemplative and deeply serious. If we accept the premise that these mathematical sequences are indeed predictive in nature, if we grant that they encode information about future events, then we must then ask the most fundamental question: how could a macaw, a bird whose brain is orders of magnitude smaller than a human brain, possess this knowledge? How could she access information about future events that have not yet occurred? There are only a few theoretical frameworks that could possibly explain this phenomenon. Only a handful of mechanisms that science has proposed that might make such a thing comprehensible. He paused for a long moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing, choosing his words with meticulous care. First, there's the possibility of some form of precognition or extrasensory perception. Abilities that mainstream science has largely dismissed and relegated to the realm of pseudoscience, but that some researchers have suggested might exist in certain animals, particularly those with heightened sensory awareness. Second, there's the possibility that Ruby somehow accessed information from an external source, perhaps through some form of non-local consciousness or quantum entanglement with information about future events. Though what that source could be is profoundly unclear and difficult to imagine. And third, there's the more speculative and philosophically challenging possibility that consciousness itself exists outside of time, that from some level of awareness or perception, Ruby could perceive past, present, and future simultaneously, viewing them as a unified whole rather than as a linear progression of moments. The room fell into profound silence as the researchers contemplated these extraordinary possibilities, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what they were discussing. Some of them were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, their bodies expressing the cognitive dissonance they were experiencing, clearly struggling with the implications of what they were being asked to consider. Others were leaning forward with intense interest, their scientific curiosity and desire to understand overriding their initial skepticism and resistance to these unconventional ideas. "We need to test these predictions," Dr. Hartwell said finally, her voice firm and decisive, cutting through the contemplative silence. If Ruby encoded future events into her song, if she truly possessed knowledge of what was to come, then we should be able to verify at least some of these predictions as time passes and events unfold. We need to document the coordinates and dates that James has identified with meticulous precision and monitor them carefully as the designated dates approach. If events do occur at the predicted locations and times, if these predictions prove accurate, then we will have evidence of something genuinely extraordinary, something that will fundamentally challenge our understanding of consciousness and reality. Over the following weeks, the research team worked with intense dedication and focus, compiling a comprehensive list of the locations and dates that appeared to be encoded in Ruby's mathematical sequences with painstaking attention to detail. There were approximately 47 distinct predictions scattered across the globe like puzzle pieces waiting to be assembled, extending over the next 5 years into the future. Some predictions involved specific geographical locations with remarkable precision. Others seemed to reference broader regions or phenomena. The team began the painstaking and meticulous process of organizing this information systematically and preparing to monitor these locations and dates with intense attention, creating a network of observers and sensors that would track developments in these areas. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly obsessed with understanding the nature of Ruby's knowledge, with comprehending how she could have possessed such extraordinary awareness. He spent countless hours reviewing footage of Ruby from throughout her life, meticulously examining hours upon hours of video recordings, looking for any indication that she possessed unusual abilities or awareness that might have been overlooked or dismissed at the time. He examined her behavioral patterns with fresh eyes, her interactions with humans and other animals, her apparent responses to events around her, searching for clues that might illuminate the mystery. Gradually, a picture began to emerge from this careful analysis of a bird who possessed a level of awareness and understanding that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for a macaw, that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond what avian neuroscience suggested was possible. One particular incident stood out vividly in his memory, an event that had puzzled him at the time, but which now took on new significance in light of what they had discovered. About 5 years before her death, Ruby had become extremely agitated and distressed for several consecutive days without any apparent cause that the zoo staff could identify. She had refused to eat, had paced restlessly in her enclosure with obvious anxiety, and had produced vocalizations that seemed to express deep anxiety and fear, sounds that the staff had never heard her make before. Then, 3 days later, a major earthquake had struck a region in Southeast Asia with devastating force, killing thousands of people and causing widespread destruction. Marcus had never made the connection at the time, had attributed Ruby's behavior to some temporary illness or mood disturbance. But now, reviewing the incident in light of what they had discovered about her apparent precognitive abilities, he wondered if Ruby had somehow sensed the impending disaster, had perceived the coming tragedy before it occurred. He brought this observation to Dr. Hartwell's attention with considerable excitement. and it sparked a new line of investigation that would prove to be both fascinating and deeply troubling. The research team began to examine Ruby's behavioral records from throughout her entire 30-year tenure at the zoo with meticulous care, looking for patterns of unusual agitation or distress that might correlate with significant events that had occurred around the world. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. There appeared to be a clear and measurable correlation between periods of Ruby's unusual behavior and major natural disasters, significant political events, major accidents, and other significant occurrences around the globe. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental, too precise to be attributed to random chance. It's as if Ruby was sensitive to major events in the world. Dr. Hartwell mused during one of their working sessions, her voice filled with wonder and concern. As if she possessed some form of awareness that extended far beyond her immediate environment, that allowed her to perceive significant occurrences happening thousands of miles away, across continents and oceans. It suggests a form of consciousness that is not limited by distance or conventional sensory channels. This discovery raised profound new questions about the nature of consciousness and awareness, questions that challenged the very foundations of neuroscience and philosophy. If Ruby could somehow perceive events occurring around the world, what did that suggest about the nature of consciousness itself? Was it possible that consciousness was not localized to individual brains, but was somehow distributed or connected across space through mechanisms science had not yet discovered? Was it possible that certain animals, or certain individuals within species, possessed the ability to access information that transcended normal sensory perception, that existed in some realm beyond the physical senses? As the research team grappled with these profound and unsettling questions, the first of Ruby's predicted events began to occur with remarkable precision. On April 15th, exactly as the mathematical sequences had indicated with stunning accuracy, a significant underwater geological event occurred at the coordinates Ruby had apparently specified with mathematical exactness. It was not a catastrophic event that would dominate news headlines, but it was a measurable phenomenon that had been predicted with remarkable precision. A seismic event that seismologists had not anticipated. The coincidence was striking and undeniable, and it sent waves of excitement and apprehension through the research community. Validating James's analysis and confirming the predictive nature of Ruby's encoded information. Over the following months, more predictions came to pass with uncanny accuracy. A rare aurora borealis event occurred at the precise location and time Ruby had apparently specified, visible from exactly the region where the mathematical sequences had indicated it would appear. A significant meteor shower was visible from exactly the region she had indicated, with the intensity and duration matching her apparent predictions. A rare animal migration pattern followed the trajectory that seemed to be encoded in her mathematical sequences, with thousands of birds following a path that Ruby had somehow foreseen. A geological formation shifted in a remote region exactly as predicted. With each prediction that proved accurate, the evidence mounted with undeniable force that Ruby had possessed knowledge of future events with a level of precision that defied conventional explanation, that challenged everything science understood about the limits of knowledge and prediction. But not all of the predictions were benign natural phenomena or neutral occurrences. Some of the encoded information seemed to reference more ominous events, more troubling developments, locations that appeared to be at risk for natural disasters, dates that coincided with potential human conflicts and violence, regions that might experience environmental catastrophes and ecological collapse. The research team found themselves in the uncomfortable and ethically complex position of possessing what appeared to be advance warning of future disasters. yet lacking the ability to act on this information in any meaningful way that would be credible to the outside world. What do we do with this knowledge? Marcus asked during one of their meetings, voicing the question that had been troubling all of them with increasing urgency, the ethical dilemma that kept him awake at night. If Ruby has predicted disasters that could harm people, don't we have a moral and ethical responsibility to warn them, to attempt to prevent the suffering she seems to have foreseen? But how can we do that without sounding like madmen, without being dismissed as cranks and conspiracy theorists? Who would believe that a dead macaw has predicted the future through mathematical sequences embedded in her final song? What credible evidence could we present that would convince world leaders and disaster prevention agencies to take action based on the predictions of a bird? Dr. Hartwell shook her head slowly, her expression troubled and weary, reflecting the weight of the responsibility they now carried. I don't know, Marcus. This is beyond the scope of what science typically deals with, beyond the established protocols and procedures that govern scientific inquiry. We're in uncharted territory here, dealing with phenomena that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality, that exist at the boundaries between science and philosophy, between the known and the unknowable. We need to proceed carefully and methodically, gathering more evidence, verifying our interpretations through multiple independent analyses, before we make any public claims about Ruby's predictions or attempt to warn anyone about potential future disasters. Yet even as they struggled with these profound ethical dilemmas and questions about responsibility, another mystery was beginning to emerge from the data with increasing clarity. The research team had been so focused and concentrated on the predictive aspects of Ruby's song, on the specific events and locations that she seemed to have encoded, that they had overlooked something equally significant and perhaps even more profound. The mathematical sequences seemed to suggest not just future events, but a pattern, a purpose, a direction that all of these events were moving toward. A grand design or underlying structure that connected them all together. And when James Chen finally decoded what that pattern suggested, after weeks of intense mathematical analysis and theoretical work, the implications proved to be even more profound and unsettling than anything they had discovered so far. I think, James said quietly during a late-night working session with Marcus and Dr. Hartwell, his voice barely above a whisper in the darkness of the Institute's main office, illuminated only by the glow of computer screens, that Ruby wasn't just predicting random future events, wasn't simply encoding information about isolated occurrences scattered across time. I think she was trying to tell us something much more fundamental about the nature of reality itself, about the direction in which the universe is moving, about the trajectory of human existence and consciousness. And if my interpretation is correct, if my analysis of these patterns holds up under scrutiny, then what's coming is far more significant than any individual disaster or natural phenomenon, far more transformative than any single event. What do you mean? Dr. Hartwell asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her body leaning forward with intense interest and underlying fear. What are you suggesting, James? What did Ruby try to encode in her song? I mean, James replied, his face pale in the light of the computer screens, his eyes reflecting the weight of what he was about to reveal, that Ruby seems to have been warning us about something fundamental and transformative, a shift in the fabric of reality itself, a transformation that will affect all of humanity at the deepest levels, a change in the nature of consciousness or existence that will alter everything we understand about ourselves and our place in the universe. And according to the timeline encoded in her song, according to the mathematical sequences that she embedded in her final composition. It's going to happen much sooner than anyone would expect, much sooner than we have time to prepare for.